Hey guys, I'm Dani Castellano, and this is Diet Culture. Nick is literally with me today, and we are talking about normal eating and how diet culture impacts the ability to eat normally, some statistics on how weight stigma can impact us from making health promoting behavior changes or just implementing them in the first place or sustaining them. Some of my experience in working in private practice with people feeling like nutrition needs to be this black and white thing that actually really prevents them from making any kind of forward progress and actually seeming to have a negative impact on mental health, and a call to action for making some change about how we speak to others about food and bodies, or about our own food and bodies to others, and asking for some more inclusivity when it comes to joyful movement and what we expect out of bodies to be. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Dan. How's it going?
Good. Guys, this is a special episode because Nick, along with several of our family members, have been out in Colorado for the past week for family vacation, and we figured we might as well record together in person. So we have, in fact, mostly squeezed ourselves into my recording studio closet to talk about normal eating. So where I'm going with this is I want to talk about how diet culture impacts normal eating and what I would consider normal eating, kind of as a reference point for when I'm discussing so much of the disordered behaviors that are going on. Ellen Satter is a registered dietitian who has done a lot of work in defining parents' roles in the division of responsibility with feeding children. And she defined a few decades ago what normal eating is. So I'm going to read that definition aloud. Normal eating is going to the table hungry and eating until you are satisfied. It is being able to choose food you like and eat it and truly get enough of it, not just stop eating because you think you should. Normal eating is being able to give some thought to your food selection so you get nutritious food, but not being so wary and restrictive that you miss out on enjoyable food. Normal eating is giving yourself permission to eat sometimes because you are happy, sad, or bored, or just because it feels good. Normal eating is mostly 3 meals a day, or 4 or 5, or it can be choosing to munch along the way. It is leaving some cookies on the plate because you know you can have some again tomorrow, or it is eating more now because they taste so wonderful. Normal eating is overeating at times, feeling stuffed and uncomfortable, and it can be undereating at times and wishing you had more. Normal eating is trusting your body to make up for your mistakes in eating. Normal eating takes up some of your time and attention, but keeps its place as only one important area of your life. In short, normal eating is flexible. It varies in response to your hunger, your schedule, your proximity to food, and your feelings. What are your thoughts on hearing that? I'm assuming that was the first time you've heard that definition.
Yeah, so I read it earlier. My thoughts as a whole are that I generally agree with the spectral approach in the sense that it's like, eating and then overeating a little here, undereating a little here, and providing room on both ends there. So I mean, like with the generality of it, I agree. But there's definitely a few things that piqued interest there, and I know there's a few specific things that piqued your interest. So why don't you go with one of those?
Okay, so overall, like you, Nick, I would say that this is pretty encompassing of a definition of normal eating. It really aligns a lot with what intuitive eating is. A couple things that I just like get poked by, and also this was written, I think, about 30 years ago. I looked earlier, it was sometime in the 1980s that this was written. So with anything written decades ago, updates are warranted. So I think that makes sense, that the more we've learned, that there would be some things. But I don't super love the disordered eating / eating disorder Um, like I find it sketchy where it says not to be so wary and restrictive. And when I hear that, being trained as an eating disorder dietitian and someone who had an eating disorder, I hear that we should be somewhat wary and restrictive. And there's certainly a caveat to that because in intuitive eating, there is a point on gentle nutrition. It's the last chapter of the book, and that's there for a reason because there's so much of healing relationship with food and learning what your body really needs when you have enough food. Before focusing on exactly what you eat is the really important thing because that it really disconnects us from our body. And so that's like when I talk about how I think that nutrition advice is overly complicated in our society. And honestly, a lot of it's just a bunch of hoopla. That's kind of where my brain goes with it because if you're truly eating intuitively, I don't know that we would use those terms of like being somewhat wary and restrictive. But I think overall it's encompassing, like I said, what the point is. Um, the under eating at times and wishing you had more, this I don't feel like this is super thoughtful for anyone with insecure access to food. I totally get like why if we just had ample supply of food and we all had that equality, that under eating at times could be a normal thing to do. I can think of several examples. For instance, if you were going to go to a restaurant you were really looking forward to, but you were hungry, it's not a good idea to just like go hungry for hours and hours if you can help it. So maybe you would eat a snack, but feel like you could eat a little bit more, but you know you're eating in another couple hours. That's an example. But if you, one, don't have access to food, that's kind of shitty because there are going to be a lot of times you undereat or aren't able to eat something that's appropriately satisfying, and that gives our body the same vibe.
Just do, and that gives our body the same.
And that gives our body the same kind of response to, not exactly, but mental restriction can bring a lot of the same issues of physical restriction. Um, and certainly, I'm not saying that it's better to have what you want than to not have access to food, but you may not feel satisfied or literally have enough food. There's a lot of people that this can be true for. And so the other side of that is that if you're purposefully dieting or have a history with disordered eating or an eating disorder, hearing that undereating at times is normal just could land in an unhelpful way depending on where you're at. Because I think we'd all interpret that a little bit differently. So that is something else that I think just needs a little bit more explanation. And then making up for your mistakes, quote unquote. Oh, normal eating is trusting your body to make up for your mistakes in eating. And that line really bothers me just because there's no mistakes that you can be making with eating. There are certainly disordered behaviors you could be engaging in. Um, and I think where that's getting at is that idea of like, oh, if you eat just an example of like the foods that we typically will stereotype, but like if you eat a donut today and have a surplus of calories, you'll end up burning it off at the end of the week because your body has, a varying amount of calories it's going to use and things like that. And that I think that thought process was like at the beginning of poking holes into diet culture was probably helpful, but now that we're a little bit more evolved in the understanding of it, I think that falls just a little bit flat, because you're not making a mistake with eating. And even if you're engaging in disordered behavior, what good does it do to be like, oh, I fucked up? Like, we can still move forward if you're able to recognize that. Certainly, if you are unaware and denial about it, that's going to be hard. But I think there's just, I'm hard pressed to find an example of how you can make a mistake with what you're eating. Um, I'm sure that it may feel like that oftentimes, so I can certainly empathize there, but I do not see them as mistakes. So I'm curious if you had other things that like you felt weird about with this definition or just how you interpreted it.
Um, Definitely, I think that one there, it'd be like, instead of the making a mistake with what you eat, definitely for me, it's making a mistake with how I eat. Like letting, like if I have a hiccup and like don't, if I skip a meal
Mm,
on accident and stuff like that.
mm,
But I feel like that's, I think one of the things this definition did that was positive is be like, that is natural.
mm,
Where uh, if I just get busy at work and I accidentally miss a meal and stuff and not like freaking out about it either way and trying to like understand how to handle that in the future and stuff like that.
mm. It's funny that you interpret it that way. I'm sure people are going to interpret this very different ways because I just go ham with my eating disorder, like protective
Well,
brain.
and honestly, yeah, I think I interpreted it the way you said too, but I would say changing it to how,
Mm,
changing the what to how would be a very simple means of like making that actually a positive
I see.
to me. Um, yeah, because that's something like, I think one of the things this definition made me think of is like just how incomprehensibly hard you would have to try to be what we would like consider like a perfect eater instead of a
Right.
normal eater.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is what our culture like encourages.
yeah, which yeah, yeah. I like enjoyed that aspect of it and
Mm-hmm.
would amend that one word. And then yeah, I thought the other thing that was funny is the way it said like when it says when you overeat, um, and how that's, it's like it said like accidentally overeating and then like
Mm-hmm.
undereating and wishing you had more.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the undereating thing was interesting, and I guess you gave a good example of like a time that you would purposefully undereat. Because I was like a little, because I feel like you so often make a choice to like overeat, but then like when you if I undereat, it's on like accident
Yeah,
for me.
I think that is probably a majority of the time, unless you're actively engaging in restriction for dieting purposes or with an eating disorder. It probably is by accident.
I got
So
you. Yeah.
I can see, I can see the more I think about this, it's funny. I'm like playing devil's advocate here. The more I think about it, I can see how that could be helpful because I have certainly had to. Okay, basically, it comes back to intentions, I think, with these things, because there could also be guilt if you're trying to heal your relationship with food and you're like, shit, I underate. Like, and then you feel a little bit good about it, but mostly guilty because you're trying to do better. And I think sometimes that is going to happen accidentally because we can't perfectly predict, even if you have a set meal plan you're following to eat enough. For example, certain exchanges or foods within the exchanges are going to be more satisfying than others depending on the day, depending on the time of day that you eat. And so there could be times where you're like, oh, I wish I had more food. And you may be in a situation where you don't have the ability to eat more right at that moment, like you ate and then you got in the car and left, something like that. And so it is important to think about that in the sense of not beating yourself up and realizing it. I just think there's a lot of ways that that can get really twisted because our culture is just like thin, 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 eat as the least amount of food as possible. And that's the filter that my brain is always reading things from, just out of place of like trying to be protective. So I think that reading this definition is actually super important because it gives very clear examples of how you like can't be a perfect eater. Like you were saying, Nick, like it kind of debunks the myth of being a perfect eater and really coming to your own conclusion of what kind of flexibility and thoughtfulness about food feels right for you because ultimately it's your body and your choice to do whatever you want to do within the resources that you have. And if you're trying to work on healing your relationship with food, likely there's going to be some work that needs to be done there. And like, what do you actually want normal eating to look like for you? Because we're going to get into some specific examples, but there's so many ways that our culture gets caught up in that makes it almost impossible to just be normal and not focusing all the time on thinking about food. So, one, if you have access, that's going to make that a foundation that you can build upon. But then, not being mentally restrictive is the other way that you're going to be able to start thinking less about food all of the time. Um, because that's what our brain and bodies are going to do when we don't have access. It's a protective mechanism. I was thinking about some of the common commentary that I hear, and these are just a couple things. But from our culture, like I can't pick this because it has too much sugar when looking at a food label. And certainly I will say that if you are needing to monitor the amount of carbohydrates you consume to keep your blood sugar steady with diabetes, I'm not adding you here. But without that, there's actually really no reason to have to limit, or I shouldn't even use the word limit, but keep consistency with the amount of carbs that you eat exactly. And so I think most of the time that's being used in a concerning way. I've been good today, so I'm going to cheat and have some ice cream. I can have a mimosa because I'm going to burn it off going for a run tomorrow. Or I feel fat today. Just some of the things that came right to my head that are unhelpful when you're working on healing relationship with food. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into like, so why does it matter? Like, okay, maybe I like my diets and I don't want to heal my relationship with food. So internalizing that you don't have the ability to eat appropriately for yourself, or that you're inadequate, or that your health is in danger because of your weight, you are shaming you. And we've proven that it can adversely impact health when we think we're shitty and incapable. And then we add the layer of financial insecurity, or living in a food desert, or being told randomly after some lab work that you have to cut out X, Y, or Z in order to fix blood sugar, cholesterol, or diabetes. And those stigmatizing things are going to make it harder to actually make health promoting choices with nutrition. So, talking about like getting a variety of food in, or getting adequate food in, or honoring your body when it's full, any of those things. In This is partially just personal opinion layered on top of the science we have about weight stigma, but in my time that I was working at private practice as an outpatient dietitian, I was noticing that most people coming to see me were feeling like they weren't capable of doing these things for themselves. And that's kind of why they ended up with me. It was like they felt like they'd hit a dead end. Rarely ever did anyone come in just wanting like proactive advice on nutrition. It was like, I've done X, Y, and Z, or my doctor said, or this, that, or the other. And rarely ever with the clientele I was working with was this coming from a financial barrier. It was the mental barrier of thinking they were incapable or stigmatizing yourself. And it literally kept people from making forward progress with health. And I'm not a lot of times people were not able to lose weight, but I don't think that that's because they were stigmatizing themselves. I think that pursuing weight loss isn't super effective. But like mentally, especially, people were so hard on themselves because they wanted to follow something, some sort of advice and set these goals, and then it wasn't actually in line with what they really needed to be doing. So there was a lot of failure and getting stuck in this place of black and white thinking and trying to figure out what was good versus bad, even when I wasn't. Certainly were times when I first started that I was giving that good versus bad advice. But even once I had realized all these things and was telling people, like, no, that's not how this works, they weren't able to process that because it takes a long time to break free from diet culture. And so, like, setting these hard rules and drawing lines in the sand, actually, I was watching people like sabotage themselves because they were trying to be perfect with eating, and and it just wasn't going to work because it doesn't work like that. Um, and that really was the last straw for me of like learning more about eating disorders and healing relationship with food, and then seeing these just like quote unquote normal people that were trying to be healthier still suffering from the same kind of things, just on probably what I would call a lesser scale, because it becomes an obsession, and then you're trying to measure it with these things that aren't even realistic. So we know that weight loss is regained in 1 to 5 years after losing it for 95% of people. And also, it's dangerous for your body to lose weight, especially rapidly. And it paints a picture of failure and needing to go to the next diet. Um, and all the behaviors often contribute to binging because you can only restrict for so long unless you end up with a full-blown eating disorder and your brain kind of goes a different route with that. But what comes up from that doesn't feel good either. So I really was just watching this like vicious cycle because one of fat phobia and us thinking that we need to be as thin as possible for our health, but just getting stuck in these rigid rules of what not normal eating, it was like what healthy eating or what clean eating, et cetera, was supposed to look like. And it wasn't like I wasn't seeing that as a health promoting thing for people to be focusing so hard on their nutrition like that. I actually felt frustrated and stuck and bad for people. And like more of the victories that I was noticing were when I could convince someone to fire their doctor for telling them they needed to go on a weight loss medication by suppressing their appetite, or were just shaming them for their weight. Like those were the kind of things that I was feeling were more important than like a couple pounds down on the scale, because I was just watching these people get stuck over and over. And that's part of why I care so much about this, because even outside of full-blown eating disorders, this this culture and this way of thinking is actually, it's life ruining. It's a waste of money from my perspective, and it doesn't really get you anywhere without it becoming an obsession, which I still don't see as progress. But and again, everyone is certainly entitled to do what they want with their bodies, but I don't see that as health promoting when you become so obsessed with it that it's taking over. That isn't healthy. Another reason that I think that it matters, like what we say about food in our bodies, is because we never know who's struggling with their relationship with food. And so while we have the right to say what we want, it's not helpful to comment about food and bodies. I think it can be alluring to get drawn into a conversation of that, because there's just so many of those conversations happening all the time that I find myself just kind of going silent, because oftentimes that feels like the easier thing to do, than to always engage with it. But it's so common. I'm sure anyone listening could think of a recent example where someone made just a really pointed negative comment about food or bodies. And it doesn't do anyone any good. It just kind of keeps us stuck in that cycle. And we have that like saying of what do people always say where it's like, oh, if I had known that's what that person was going through, maybe I would have treated them differently. And well, that in and of itself, I'm like, well, maybe we should just not treat people like shit as a baseline. But that's the same thing that this reminds me of like if you knew that commenting on someone in your life's plate was perpetuating like a raging eating disorder, a horrendous body image that they were struggling with, you probably wouldn't do it, or you may just be, well, you may be set in your ways and not care, but you may also be open to like wanting to know how you could help, because I think the majority of us who care about people in our lives don't want to hurt them. And by just like making these comments, it is super hurtful. And I can say that from experience and from hearing other people's experience. And I think that's something we can all relate on, of just like having really unhelpful things being said to you. But when it comes to something so personal as your body and food, um, it's just like, can't we talk about other things?
I think, yeah, one of the things to not only commenting on the plate of others, so that, right, commenting on the plate of others is something that I have completely, like, I rarely do that in terms of like commenting on the size of the plate of someone
Mm-hmm.
else or how they're eating it, right? That's like
Mm-hmm.
I've cut that out completely. But something that I realized on this Denver vacation, in which we had our whole family over, which is a few people and of ranging bodies and philosophies on food, right? I would say not everybody that was at the table consistently was like an intuitive eater. I would say
Mm-hmm.
not everybody is of the same body size and of
Mm-hmm.
the same privilege, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that. But something I find myself saying a lot on this trip was I'm stuffed. Um, and I found that to be a very divisive thing that I want to take out of my vocabulary when
Hmm.
eating at restaurants in the company of others. Um, because anytime, like I said, that was a big trigger for it, or not necessarily a trigger, but that was the softball, if you will, for someone to um, begin the conversation with very stereotypical diet culture self-shamey
Mm-hmm.
things. um
Because being stuffed does have a really negative connotation, even if you
yeah,
aren't saying it to be like berating yourself. I think we can all envision.
yeah, in which and that's, and that's something like it, I do this thing where it's like I have this want where like I want to be able to say something like that and not offend other people, but
Hmm.
that's not, that needs to take a back seat because it's really like that want for me to be able to speak openly about food comes, I think, from a place of like elongated privilege and
Hmm.
being able to uh, not associate those things with self shame in my own self. So that definitely needs to take a back seat, and like just go with more helpful terms like commenting on the taste of the food of the meal, because
Hmm.
I think that is still like an appropriate thing to be able to do. That was a good meal. Should, I think, like
Hmm.
hopefully be able to.
I think so. I have thought about that actually many times, of like, there are instances in which someone can lose their taste, and I suppose that could be hurtful or offensive. Um, I don't see any other particular circumstances that I'm aware of that is a an inappropriate comment to make. I think bringing, like, coming together for community around food in a positive way is actually a really important, like, self-care and like health promoting thing, because we need food to live, and it does bring community, and it's different in all different kinds of culture. So I do see that as a positive thing. But if anyone has any opinions on that, I'd certainly love to hear.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. Or other like table talk ideas,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like there's so many things that need to be said or not need to be said. Obviously, just
Need.
talked about one of them doesn't, but so many things where you're like, how to talk about food
Mm-hmm.
productively at a dinner table with, and these are people like, this is like that's like a safe space for me too.
Yeah,
and
same.
and it's still so like I still am like pushing boundaries and not being as inclusive as I could be. So like, you know what I'm saying? Like learning to
Mm-hmm.
use those.
Yeah, and I I think what you were getting at a little bit ago with saying like you wish you could just say what you wanted and it wouldn't be hurtful to other people, but that being kind of like a privileged perspective. I think that's a big part of my point of, well, one, this entire podcast, but this particular episode of just having the desire to not that I never want to upset someone, but it's like just being like not unnecessarily saying things that can perpetuate harm or pain in someone else, just by being a little bit more self-aware and seeking some of that information. Like that's something I'm interested in and part of why this career and this podcast are important to me. And so that's a lot of like what a theme will be. And I certainly get where people are coming from. Like you can't make everyone happy. And we're not shaming you if you don't want to do that, but I think that is a common like theme of wanting to try and be a little bit better, just to like there's already so much harm happening, like maybe do some harm reduction just by things we don't say, because it's not even having to say it correctly. There's a lot that we could just not say and it would be so much more helpful.
Yeah, and I've found that specific sentence that I'm somehow still talking about was almost exclusively unnecessary. Like it was almost like one of those like I'm just cutting air sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm just bored, so I need to like throw a word out there. So I just again I was like that's completely unnecessary for me to be saying, and I don't like no one can gain anything from
Right.
this. It only is yeah. So
And I noticed there was a particular instance where I stopped eating and I made a comment about how I was like done eating something, which is very similar to like saying I'm stuffed. And I like noticed this like trickle effect of other people changing what they were doing with that food because it brought this awareness to it of like they were doing whatever they were doing, minding their own business. And suddenly I'm talking about not eating some food, which is like a in our diet culture, that is almost like a something to get pat on the back for, is not eating too much. And so to have that self restraint, quote unquote, is like highly regarded. So just talking out loud about things that really don't need to be said can be kind of uh, harmful, even in safe spaces. So I think that's pretty much the gist of my tangent there. Do you have anything?
nope, that wraps up for me. What else?
Okay, so there are some statistics on NIDA's website. And so I know NIDA is not a perfect organization, and there was some heat that came towards them during Eating Disorder Awareness Week, just about like everyone having a seat at the table. And like we can Google companies and see that not everyone has seats at tables. But they have some helpful statistics on their site. And it's just for me like more evidence of like why I care about what people are saying about food and bodies. So I'm just going to read a few of these that really strike me. The best known environmental contributor to the development of eating disorders is the sociocultural idealization of thinness. So really what that means is cultures that don't have the obsession with thinness like we do don't have the rates of eating disorders like we do. Like there's certainly other factors, but that's a big part of it, is just because we idealize it or idolize it. Idealize? Is idealize a word?
Idolize is OL, and idealize would
Are
be
they both the
EA.
same?
I think they're both words. Idolize would be like you make something your idol,
Because this one
like a
says
statue.
idealization of thinness.
That would be like making thinness your ideal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think that is
similar concept. Okay. By the age of 6, girls especially start to express concerns about their own weight or shape. 40 to 60% of elementary school girls aged 6 to 12 are concerned about their weight or about becoming fat. So that really just like pulls at my heartstrings. A lot of the work that I do always comes back to like trying to protect kids from like joining the next generation and cycle of people who hate their bodies in our culture, because it starts so young and it will never end unless you break up with it when you are old enough to have that awareness. And I think that's really important and kind of a call to action, because things like that Weight Watchers app Curbo that was helping kids diet, like that's not helpful. And the quote unquote obesity crisis in the United States, like I don't care about that argument because it is more harmful to do this to children for all of the reasons that I've listed thus far than it is to, like, first of all, kids that come in different body sizes just as a baseline. And so we teach children to be concerned about their weight at such a young age. And that is something that I hope we can shift. I hope we can shift it for everyone. But the fact that it's starting 6 years into life on the planet is, to me, really horrifying and enough of a reason to like model by example.
Yeah, and I would just like to like speak on that to like not necessarily just so my like earliest understandings of self-identity would have been like the two thing like I was people would comment on my weight as a young child and it was always two things. It was always like a compliment or an insult. It would be like, you're so blank, you have to eat more, or you're so blank, good for you. And then like the other thing was like I got called chicken legs when I was young because I had really small like legs, whatever, which is like a it's you grow through adolescence, and that's maybe you'll outgrow that, maybe that's part of you, either way. But I'm just saying, like, I don't even think people were trying to be, and I'm not like, oh, there's definitely some people listening to this podcast that use those terminologies and they didn't like, so everything's good, people, but that definitely just like those two things like definitely went a long way in going how I view myself, whether that was positive or negative. And that's from like age, the earliest that I understood life. So yeah, definitely just affirming that as being an immense thing. And definitely like, and I think it's, I don't know, just being as encouraging as you can, I guess, is the solution to that. And as like open and as like non, uh, like uh, being more like loving and less identifying about people's like bodies, I guess, when they're young could go a long way.
Well, yeah, because children can, in fact, identify being loved and being worthy with being beautiful or with being thin enough because of comments that get made about their bodies to them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, totally. One more statistic that I want to read here. Weight-based victimization among overweight youths has been linked to lower levels of physical activity, negative attitudes about sports, and lower participation in physical activity among overweight students. Among overweight and obese adults, again, I don't love using either of those terms, but they're in the statistics. Those who experience weight-based stigmatization engage in more frequent binge eating, are at increased risk for eating disorder symptoms, and are more likely to have a diagnosis of binge eating disorder. So my point of that isn't like, oh, if you're stigmatized, you're gonna end up in a larger body, and that's why I don't like super love some of these categories. However, the point being is like driving home that the stigma causes us to not engage in health promoting behaviors because you can't shame yourself into being healthy. That's just not how we work psychologically. And so I don't know when we're going to stop doing that, but also I do want to make the point. I see so many people trying to help others lose weight by loving themselves. It's like just because you say that doesn't change the stigma, because you cannot inherently change something about yourself if you don't think it needs to be changed. And that has a negative connotation. If you think you need to lose weight, you are saying this is something that's wrong with me that does need to be changed. And I know there's a lot of arguments I can get with this one, but they don't go together. You can't accept and love yourself if you're also saying I'm fat and I need to lose weight. They don't exist and in the same space. And so just because we pretend that, it's kind of like almost like, I think I overuse the term gaslight, but it almost seems like a gaslighting situation to me, because it's like, what, there's got to be a better word for what I'm getting at with that, but it's not genuine. And I think it's meant to be genuine, but just because we call a diet something else or call weight loss something else doesn't mean it's not the exact same thing. And I think that's a really hard pill to swallow, especially for providers who are trying to be helpful, or like life coaches or whatever the heck, who are trying to be helpful by not shaming people like we have done more stereotypically in the past in that realm of like personal trainer and dietitian. They're trying to be kinder, but by still reinforcing the concept of needing weight loss to be better, healthier, whatever more attractive you're shooting for, it just doesn't actually work.
I think, and this is just a quick little tangent I'm going to try to do, but that making some more space for people who want to participate in things that we idealize, like sports, with varying body types is really important. Because I know when I was in like 6th grade, I wanted to play basketball, and I tried out for the team and I missed it. And I did that 7th grade and 8th grade. I wasn't able to make the basketball team for 3 years in a row. And so I wasn't able to play basketball with my peers at a competitive level. And that really did a lot of damage to my psyche at that age, and definitely was like a leading factor in me succumbing to disordered eating and disordered exercising, I would say, in later, like short-term later life. And so making more like room for people to be able to do things in a less idealized manner, I think is a dope thing to do moving forward, because there, it's that right now it's like you have to have an ideal or an exact body to do this or this, but you really don't. Like, you can do it at varying levels, and that needs to be done more and accommodated more for our youngins moving forward.
And I can literally hear like, but if you're not built for that, it's like it's a competition, it's a game to win. So if you're not going to be helpful, why would someone put you on the team? I've never been an athlete, so I've always had a problem with organized sports for that reason, because I just think like knowing some of what I know about the exclusivity and just the really impossible and sometimes harmful conditioning that happens to people to have the body they're supposed to have is not healthy. And I just like, I'm like joyful movement, joyful movement. So when we literally prohibit people from being joyful because we're worried about trophies and money, it's like, what are we doing? I literally don't understand it. Because I've never had that. Like, I'm a competitive person, but never when it comes to like sports has that ever been a thing. So I agree. Like, I think that's really unfair. And like also that makes me think of something that's been talked about a lot recently within it being Pride Month is people who are transgender wanting to play sports for the body that they identify with and are, but not being allowed, just similar to the bathroom debacle that's gone on. It's like we're not going to let someone play for that reason either. So there's just so many layers of prohibiting someone from being able to be active and enjoy moving their body that are so harmful. And again, I'm not speaking from experience, just like my opinion on those things.
Yeah, and definitely not attacking athletes at
No.
all. Just saying like space,
Mm-hmm.
open the space, open the field a little bit more for everybody.
Yeah, it would be nice. The normal eating piece, I think that is an individualized path, but these barriers from diet culture that we're raised with from literally day one, because comments are made about bodies while they're under 1 years old and forever, aren't helpful to actually discovering what that would be. We had donuts for breakfast this morning, and I posted that it's actually normal to eat donuts for breakfast and not feel guilty about it, and a few other things. And I was thinking like how abrasive that message felt to me even like 5 years ago, probably, where I was very much concerned about making the best food choices, and just like normalizing donuts for breakfast is goes against the grain of what our society says, but it is food and it provides energy, which is the point of food. And so really we need to come back to that. Sure, it may not be the most sustaining meal because it's not paired with a protein that can help you stay fuller for longer, and there's not much fiber going on and the things that can actually help to like sustain you longer, but it does provide energy. And not every meal that you eat needs to look this exact balanced way in order for you to be eating normally and to be eating even healthfully if that's something that you choose to do. And so I just wanting to kind of extend some compassion, because I know how abrasive some of this can sound and almost just like crazy at times, but just wanting to plant some seeds for how it could look a little bit different if you are listening to this with the desire to have a more normalized relationship with food so that it's not this thing that's literally ruling your entire life. Thank you for listening. Diet Culture is co-produced by myself and my brother, Nick Lewis. You can keep up with what's going on with diet culture on my Instagram page at Dietitian Dani Cast. If you prefer to watch rather than just listen, check us out on YouTube, and we always love ratings and reviews if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for your support, and can't wait to talk to you next week.